actually, while we're going to probably start with the slides on that one. So we'll go there.
Yeah.
And we're on, which is great.
Yeah, we're all good.
And
so there's possibly a few different slides. 15
minutes and then 10 minutes.
Okay, I might grab the program.
Yeah. Let's wait for Alice. Is Jeff Davis back yet, by any chance? Or is he still eating his lunch? He may be still eating his lunch. No, he's not back yet. I was only saying because lots of people want to buy his book. Should you happen to see Jeff come in a minute?
He was talking to Bill Mitchell last night, saw him.
Ah. Oh, well, that's nice. Yeah. I'm a secret lemonade drinker. It's amazing what raisins can do. Can I remember? Oh, Alice. Hi. Yeah. Well, take a seat at the front. We've got. Actually, would you mind sitting there? This is David.
Hello, David. I'm Alice.
And this is Alison, and this is Alice. Sorry.
Hello.
And this is Alex.
Hi, Alex.
So it's
How
all,
are you?
it's
Yeah.
all the
How are you going?
Yeah. And Alison and Alex have got some slides, and David has got a picture. Yes. You're just going to talk. Great. Thanks.
So what order are we in?
We're going Alison. Yes. We're going David. Yes. We're going Alex. And we're going Alice.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, thanks very much.
No worries, thank you.
So it's future of work, it's new start, it's job guarantee, and it's homelessness, that sort of thing.
Housing.
Housing. Pardon? Thank you very much. A very nice man called Alex, who is, if you live here, he does a concert once a year in a church near here, and he is the best pianist in the state. Where are you, Alex? There he is. I mentioned Alex because he just reminded me to turn the recording equipment back on. That man is a genius. You've got to hear him play piano one day.
Does Phil need these?
Yeah, just clarifying, talking about the unemployment industry in relation to basically how unemployment is a political choice. That leads into why we need big ideas like job guarantee.
Absolutely.
Cool. Just clarifying.
Yeah. All right. I'll leave you to explain that.
That's all right. Don't stress. Just I'm talking about the unemployment.
The unemployment. Yeah. No, it's great. Thank you. So there's Alison's slides. We're all ready to go. And change my glasses. Okay, we better get going. We're about 5 minutes over time, but that's not too bad. Now, my brain is a bit frazzled at this stage, so forgive me for that. Our first speaker this afternoon, of 4 speakers that we're going to hear from over the next hour, is Alison Pennington, who is from the Centre for Future Work at the Australia Institute, and she is going to talk to us about the future of work. So thank you very much. Alison, please go.
hold a mic.
Do you want to? That's the mic you want.
Can do that very well.
Yes, thanks.
Do you want to put it on?
My friend works in sound.
My amateurishness is coming to the fore again. Thanks.
That's all right. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you to the organisers for an opportunity to briefly speak with you. As always, I have a strong appetite to deliver lots of information and tell lots of stories, and so I'm going to try and look at my notes and make sure I can keep to my time. But inevitably, the story is a long one. But I think the power of what we do is how well we can communicate things in shorter periods of time and with less words. It's also a pleasure to be back in Adelaide, which is my home city. My family's from the Port, proud western suburbs. Woo! Oh, I'm so glad I got some responses from that. Port Adelaide proud. Yes, I'm a massive AFL fan as well. Yeah. And I come from a family of my dad's a plumber, previously BLF CFMEU as a union man, and my mum a long-term registered nurse and part of the nurses union too. And that informs how I have approached economics as a unionist and as well as a young woman living in Australia at this point in time. So the benefit of presenting at this kind of stage in the discussion is that I have the benefit of hearing other people and being able to, I think, try and offer where I think the discussion can be improved or layered upon. And so I put this together this morning in light of some of the stuff we discussed yesterday. And it's about, I should say what it's about, we're talking about building a high investment, sustainable, full employment economy. So we're building up this picture of what it is that we're talking about. Because it is clear from our discussions and from our experience living in a quarry of the global economy that is controlling our politics and has huge economic power, which is the mining and resources sector. It's clear that this period of neoliberalism of the last few decades is failing more and more people. It's failing our environment. It's failing our communities and our families. And while I think a lot of the discussion has been about the important role we can play advocating for and building theory and power behind getting government to invest in the stuff that we need and we know that our environment needs, I also now want to build on that and turn our attention to that question of investment, because it hasn't been discussed much, and the private sector in particular, because the private sector is where a small amount of people have the power to press the green button to mobilise economic resources that create jobs, incomes, and get the whole machine in motion. And I think it's really, really important for us to understand how investment works, what is the dynamism behind it, in order for us to understand how to mould it and to shape it in a way that meets our collective interests long term. And to do that, we place work at the start, and the frame of our analysis is most important. And because I'm on a Future of Work panel, and this is also bread and butter stuff for the Centre for Future Work where I'm at, I want to just bring your attention to some of the really dangerous myths around how we conceive of work and the future of work, because they're designed to disorient us from the real questions of the day. So despite the story of and the reality that we've had this massive explosion in technological innovation and new capacities in tech to, build bodies of data and make judgments, the kinds of cognitive work that we assumed humans could do. We've had these developments, artificial intelligence being one. But despite this explosion in new tech, work is still central to how it is that an economy functions, and we have to keep this in mind. Much of the tech hype displaces that really important role of productive human work. And a lot of the time we think about work, we think it's something we perform for a boss, something we perform for an employer. But actually productive human activity, that is paid and unpaid work, is what is essential to maintaining our existence as humans and to our well-being long term. Our physical and mental effort is what transforms in the production process resources that we hopefully harvest in a sustainable way, and it transforms those resources into useful goods and services. Automation, then, I think we should be clear about, is a process of more indirect labour, but also robots, if you want to call them, but like machines and tech, these things also have to be created, they have to be conceived, they have to be manufactured, and that is also requiring work. Another damaging narrative we have around the place is that labour-saving automation is on the rise. It is definitely the case in some places that have more coordination in their economies, but it is definitely not the case in Australia. For tech to be replacing labour in production, it needs to be around the same price or cheaper than it costs to hire a worker. And that gives you a clue as to why it is that we have a declining rate of investment in new capital, which is all of the stuff that the productive capacity of an economy needs and what tech is embedded within. This picture looks way more like this. This is the real capital, private capital spending in the Australian economy from 2012 to 2019, and you see a collapse of more than a third since 2012. And this runs totally counter to the story of robots coming for our jobs, because if we saw that, we would see businesses investing in new tech, and that would be shooting up somewhere. Of course, part of this story is the decline of the mining boom and of that initial investment that went into creating the capacity to mine that we see now, but it's equally a story of the failure of government policy to create another industry plan and a plan for where it is that we're going next. And so what the outcome of this picture is one of an oversupply of underutilised work. We are talking a lot about unemployment, but I think we should think about and have an insight into the scale of what this looks like. The official unemployment rate is 700,000 people, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, right? Just there's a picture there to make that clear. Underemployment, which is a scourge in our labour market at the moment, is now up to 8.5%. 1.2 million people are in work, but without enough hours work. The marginally attached, which do not even make our government statistics, are up to 1 million people who are discouraged, who basically in the week, the reference week that the statistics were taken, weren't looking for work with the prescribed requirements set by our welfare system. That's 1 million people, and I definitely, in my experience, have found myself in that pool before as well. So the total slack is more like 3 million. Adjusted for the labour force, 20% of the labour force is without enough work right now in Australia. And what we see from this picture is the hype versus reality. We have an explosion of low-wage, piecemeal, shitty, low productivity, low-quality jobs. And that's lots of lows that I use there, but that's a really important part of the story of what's happening in our economy right now. The hype is that robots are coming. The reality is that we have a poor underclass of workers writing meals to people for $5 a pop. And I think we're starting to see that in our productivity stats, which is not only are workers not achieving or gaining the real value of what they're creating in productivity, but their wages are falling far behind. This is only from 2000, but this is a trend that goes on for 45 years. And we see that productivity is slowing now, and this is a lot to do with the fact that we have an army of very cheap, exploitable labour right now, and no incentive for employers to be investing in new tech. Do you see how that kind of plays out? And the outcome is that this is the overall share of national income, or the value that we produce together, that is going to all working people in their wages and salaries and superannuation payments, has been consistently declining since the mid-70s, now at a post-war low of around 46%, 48%. So this moves into the question of a full employment plan. It's definitely a meaningful and really important progressive goal. There is no shortage of work that we have to do, whether it be, caring for each other or caring for environment. There's a lot of research that goes into, cataloguing the many, many things that we know need to be done, but which the market is currently unwilling to pay people to do. So I'm proposing that we need a jobs engine that is firing on all cylinders. It's it's expansive, it's comprehensive, it would necessarily pull on lots of different levers and use lots of different tools, and I don't think that in our efforts to build the world that we want, we should be limiting ourselves. We should be always open to that discussion. I've put here that we should be aware that we need to increase not just jobs but full-time jobs, and I would say maybe 80% is considering the rate of women's workforce participation and their caring requirements or expectations too. It should be about 80%. We want to build participation and rebuild the job quality, which is declining as well. And I've put here a picture of the Finnish Prime Minister who's pushing a 4-day work week policy and is building in popularity, but I've also put a picture below of the Finnish postal workers on strike, which are also behind clearing the space for someone like her to come through, because the previous guy basically failed to manage this quite important strike in Finland. But I'm writing here as well that the full employment plan that we move towards will look quite different to the 1945 white paper, not in the least because we've had the entry of millions of women into the labour market. Full employment in 1945 was based on a full-time male breadwinner, and that's not what our labour market looks like anymore. Services jobs are going to be a much bigger part of that story, because the 45 white paper was also about, it was very interlinked with industry policy. I do think that's a key and important part of what we do going forward. I'll speak on that in a sec. But I think services jobs will change the overall shape of what that looks like. Of course, green jobs will do that too. And it's been discussed, there was a question yesterday about work time, and this was actually a historic movement in the labour movement towards capturing some of that productivity growth, some of that extra value that's been created by people in work into shorter working hours. And I think that should be key and a focus of any full employment plan we have going forward, recognising that there are millions of people without enough work as well. So it's also about shifting the overall balance of hours. How am I going for time? Okay, yeah, cool. So I'll outline some of the things that I think this high investment, sustainable and full employment economy would have. It would be about getting more investment into better places that expand human and environmental well-being. That would be normally forthcoming from capitalists, those who have the control over investment at the moment, that they would do on their own. So this is about expanding public spending, but it's also about and unpicking the control that a small number of people have over the public coffers. That's the political question. But it's also about redirecting private investment. It's about managing the overall impacts of growth to maximise the social benefit and minimise environmental costs. And I think we're beginning to discuss that yesterday with the environmental economics session. I've noted here that I think I've been following some of the narrative in the US with Bernie Sanders' framing of climate change as an alternative war, essentially. It's a war mobilisation requiring economic, political, social resources. And I've been thinking about the salience of that sort of framing for Australia. I think in this crisis that we face right now, the bushfire crisis, this concept of mobilising people behind the war that's on our front before Morrison sends troops off to Iran, I think that's a powerful way for us to be thinking. I also think I'm an avid history fan. I'm trying to understand the history of colonialism in Australia and how it's been pieced together. But I think there's also like a strong anti-establishment, anti-state sentiment in Australia, which is a reflection of the fact that the working class was transported here as convicts and in chains, and there's like there isn't a relationship to something like a government employment program that wouldn't have some political ramifications and issues for people, I think. I can't speak at length on that now, but something I've just been thinking about. So this policy, internally consistent policy mix would be firing on fiscal, innovation, labour, social issues, financial regulation, macro, expanding spending power, infrastructure and trade industrial issues. So it's, I think I've got, some outlines of what I think some of these policies could look like. In addition to labour market policies that might increase the coordination, the bargaining power of workers, because we have historic low levels of bargaining power, injecting new resources and planning into the skills and training systems. Our vet sector is just about collapsed. Privatisation has been a woeful policy for it. It's doing all sorts of damage to our skills pipeline. And also, how far do we go with allowing universities to straddle this public-private sort of hybrid model before we reel them and say you've got requirements to provide things that we need as well. So I think there's lots of, there's a skills policy we have to look into, but a good jobs plan must, and I talk about this a lot, must promote local industry and a rebuilding of our industrial base. And this is not to be, you know, I'm not a hardcore industrialist, but I don't think there is so long that we can rely on digging crap out of the ground and exporting it with very little value add, and so then very little quality jobs and meaningful work for people to do, and then be purchasing manufacturers back from other places in the world. And it's not sustainable. The most sustainable economies right now are those who have been isolated from global capitalism, right? Cuba is going to be fine. Right? And it's because it's existed under siege, but we are really poorly positioned. So our policy mix would try and pivot away from that reliance on export of raw resources and look at more strategic and promising environmental industries that Australia might be well positioned to do, such as water technology, electric vehicles, so leveraging some of our capacity in automotive manufacturing and expanding that. And smart grid technology is another example. Overall, it would be a model of public funding playing more of a crowding in model, by public funding condensing itself in particular industries and attracting private sector investment to the table. And then, of course, we would have to be planning for labour market impacts, and that is a deep and a discussion that's being had out right now across unions. And I'll finish on this, and thank you, I know that I've gone over my 10 minutes, because we should be aware that there are very, very strong power dynamics within an economy. That's why I started my presentation by framing the question of private sector investment and moulding investment. We want to mobilise anyone who wants a job to have a job, to be involved in this high investment, high employment, sustainable economy. But we should be aware that employers are not going to sit back and allow a full employment economy. The system of discipline and the threat of the sack is really, really important to maintaining low wages and therefore higher profit rates, so lower compensation to increase their profit rates. And overall, it's a system of discipline that's really important for maintaining the long-term sustainability and longevity of private investment and profit. So this is why at the Centre for Future Work we put a lot of emphasis on building up the capacity of labour market institutions like unions to be able to best manage what is going to be an inevitable conflict between different interests about the distribution of that end product after production in profit. So I've offered here that centralised wage bargaining, it hasn't been discussed in terms of the question of managing inflation, but I think it's an area of work that I want to go deeper into. I have a background in studying collective bargaining, and it's work that I've read from Jeff Harcourt as well. He's done a lot of this stuff. In many ways, it's history repeating, and we're back to the same questions of what is the role of a more democratic way of managing the economy through centralised wage bargaining, giving people a say over their workplaces and their wages within an overall economic system. Andres gave a brilliant sort of summary of the question of democratic governance. I also think this is key to be able to keep this up long term. We have to divulge power and decentralise power to people who can have more control over their resources, purely because they have a closer relationship to those as well. The UK has done some, this discussion of democratic governance has been really well progressed in the UK because of the nationalisation agenda that Corbyn had been riding on the back of. I guess there was a big campaign to nationalise failing and important strategic industries, and then there's been a corresponding movement to discuss what is beyond nationalisation, because like pure bureaucratic control of really important resources isn't an end point either. There's got to be something we do after that. And finally, to keep this up in the long run, we should be thinking about how we decrease our reliance on private investment, decrease our reliance on the fact that a smaller and smaller number of people have the ability to mobilise our economic resources. And I think it's implicit in the discussions we're having already, but I think we should be aware that that might mean not just expansion of public services and expansion of public services to provide all human needs, but then what is the role of public enterprise as in that broader picture, or that broader mix? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alison. That was great. And if David would like to come up now, and Coco will help him with the equipment.
Thank you.
All right, we're just going to trade. Yeah. Great. David is from both the Friends of the Earth and is a visiting research fellow at Flinders University. David was brought up in his infancy in the political economy of Ben Chifley by his late father. At the University of Adelaide, he studied Australian and Keynesian political economy under Bruce McFarlane. He's a student of Marxist capital and an admirer of modern monetary theory. He's going to talk to us briefly about New Start and the need to raise New Start.
Am I audible? Good. Reluctant Lazarus, the one big raise and no start. Vox populi, vox Dei, the Romans used to say. The voice of the people is the voice of the gods. Now in the late neoliberal era, there is the unemployment benefit New Start, which has been kept at hunger levels for a generation. It is accordingly colloquially known as No Start. This regime is an effective poor law, whose puritanical precedents and dysfunctional economics are the twin faces of an ethos which stretches back centuries to the Tudor dispossession of the English peasantry and the bourgeois workhouse reforms of the early 19th century. The current static level of New Start is worse than a crime, it's a blunder. The modern political perspective, which deserves the name of the Machiavellian ethic, rejects the inhuman Humean dissociation of ethics and rationality. Principle and pragmatism are one to the modernist political activist and cannot be divorced or contrasted. Society cannot function if the masses are denied meaningful work, and inadequate welfare payments are a barrier to employment. 4 million Australians went hungry at some time during 2018, according to Foodbank's Hunger Report. In these days of lingering recession and low growth, food scavenging, now known as dumpster diving, is revived from the Great Depression era. The poor are with us again, including the under-remunerated working poor on the minimum wage. Collective bargaining, a human right, is effectively shackled under the Fair Work regime. We have virtually returned in a deunionised labour market to direct, unmediated 19th century master and servant industrial relations. According to the Australian Council of Social Security, 50% of New Start recipients are long-term unemployed over 45, who don't obtain even an hour's work fortnightly. Underemployment of those who work hours inadequate to sustain them is rife. Income and job insecurity is general except for the well-to-do. In 2018, 3 million Australians lived in poverty according to ACOS and the University of New South Wales, with 1 in 8 adults and 1 in 6 children impoverished. Most people on New Start live below the Henderson poverty line on $40 a day. This parlous situation has been deliberately brought about since circa 1975 in this country as part of a neoliberal cultural cringe in a global marketplace. Gandhi said, "The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable." You will know this argument well, so I will not tarry to develop it. By the end of this speech, I hope you will feel comfortable in arguing to the major parties, which have cast humanity aside, the socio-economic case for genuine social welfare payments, within or without the context of a universal basic income, first mooted in Australia by Sydney University economists in the 1940s. A measured reinvention of the welfare state must be complemented by an Australian job guarantee, providing full employment for all who want it on equitable terms. You will confidently connect the one big raise of New Start, the disability support pension, youth allowance and parenting payment with a genuine full employment Green New Deal. Central to this will be a just energy transition to an industry policy in sunrise energy technology, We must initiate rebuilding of the secondary renewable energy sector. Green jobs and growth must be our watchword. 1 in 4 New Start recipients have an illness or disability but do not receive the disability support pension. This unmet need must be remedied. Around 1 million Australians scraped a living on welfare payments as of December 2018. According to the 2019 Essential Research Report, in 2018, 72% of Australians, aware that 70% will live in a household accessing a welfare benefit at some point in their lifetime, were in favour of raising welfare payments to cover basic expenditure. Poverty, through economic adversity including illness, can strike anyone, directly or indirectly through loved ones. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there is only 1 job for every 8 job seekers looking for paid full-time employment or extra hours. There was a grand total of 2 rental properties available in the whole country for the myriads of single New Start recipients. Growing homelessness for ever wider sections of society is already at an aggregate rate of 1 in 200 per night, according to Anglicare's 2019 rental affordability snapshot, with Adelaide being the most housing-stressed mainland capital. We could do worse than update and reinvent the housing trusts on a state or federal basis to build quality affordable housing. Around 100,000 parents, mostly single women, have been inappropriately placed on New Start and its crazy culture of punitive mutual obligations. These are socio-economic figures bespeaking market failure and slow growth at greatest cost to those least able to afford it. Such growth as there is restricted to raw material exports suffering from low terms of trade, leaving us exposed to global headwinds and shocks as during the Great Depression. Growth in employment, commerce, consumption or effective demand, for example in health, education, housing and welfare, is throttled. These costs are uneconomic. A reserve army of labour will not be job ready if it is not placed in a condition to eat healthily and dress for a job interview. Business lobbies have recognised this and called for New Start to be raised. We cannot afford to leave a generation to rot, financially incapacitated from social integration and labour market participation on the insufficient monetary dole. The Basics card, proposed by a plutocrat with no understanding of welfare recipients, would force the poor onto the tender mercies of grocer oligopolies and off-fresh food supplied by small businesses. It is a wasteful, expensive and counterproductive exercise in grinding the face of the poor. Its experimentation should be discontinued immediately. The Australian government needs to commit to the reinvigoration of the public sector because it alone can reinflate the economy back to prosperity in conjunction with unleashing organised labour to secure adequate wage growth, also stalled for too long due to union-bashing microeconomic reforms. The poor cannot afford to be hoarders. They must spend judiciously to survive rather than save. This imperative we may call the Kalecki effect, after the wartime Polish economists who first noticed it. Any stimulus directed at the poor, rather than cashed up, hoarding, saving taxpayers, will flow immediately through to retail goods and services, lifting all boats at once. Accordingly, all benefits, including New Start, should be raised by $75 weekly, indexed to inflation and wage growth. Commonwealth rent assistance for New Start recipients should be immediately raised by 30% or $20 weekly as a first step. Administration of Social Security should be depoliticised and placed in the hands of a Social Security Commission advising Parliament on income support settings. The time for ideology is past. We must do what is necessary, casting aside small state dogma. Climate action is potentially a great public sector employer, for there is much to do with the country burning from end to end through the early part of a long hot summer. Riverine remediation is a prerequisite for the communities of the Murray-Darling Basin. After all, no river, no industry, no community. Research, protection and action are needed in the Great Australian Bight, not investment in perilous retro-industrial fossil fuel extraction. The Great Barrier Reef has been substantially damaged to the detriment already of a remunerative tourism industry. This process must be reversed. There are any number of ecological precincts which likewise need attention. Under neoliberal austerity economics, secondary industry has been trashed, oversimplifying our socio-economy to the point where, according to Harvard University, Senegal is at 92nd on the ranking of economic complexity, lies above Australia, which lies just before 94th ranked Pakistan. Australia has been de-developed and must be redeveloped. Far from becoming an innovative, clever country, Australia has returned to being a hole in the ground, as Alison mentioned. A lucky country which cannot ride its luck forever, as Donald Horne famously noted in coining the ironic phrase. Australia has successfully carried out such remediation before, during the era of post-war reconstruction in the 1940s, our most effective, innovative and creative period. What has been achieved before, laying the groundwork for decades of sustainable prosperity, can be reinvented and achieved again. The play for the era in South Australia demonstrates how long an ascendancy can be secured by visionary political dispensation. Our advocacy must therefore be non-partisan, nationally and internationally aware and locally focused. There is a great role to be had by an innovative state government in South Australia. Industry policy must be a key component of the Australian Green New Deal for sustainable prosperity. Such must be the log of claims of a vast social movement. Whilst individual activity to this end must not be sneezed at, we must all make common cause as much as possible through events like this conference. Thank you.
I'd like to thank David for that heartfelt essay. And I'd like to add to it that if you want my vote, if you're a progressive party at a general election, don't go to the election without, under the circumstances we've had in the last year or two, committing to raising New Start before the election. The next speaker is Alex North, who is the National Coordinator of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union and a writer. And I've heard Alex speak many times, and it's going to be a pleasure to hear him speak again. I'll just line up his slides.
Cool. This one's left, this one's right.
And Alex is going to speak to us about something that I think we're all familiar with, which is the unemployment industry in Australia. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me, guys? All good? Great, let's go. All right, my name's Alex North. I'm the National Coordinator of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. And I'm going to be talking to you guys about today something pretty contradictory. I'm going to be talking about an industry of unemployment, and I'm going to be talking about its relationship to the labour market. So how many of you guys recognise that building? Quite a few hands, quite a few local historians here. That's the now currently part of the Migration Museum of Adelaide in South Australia. But in the 19th century, that used to be the Adelaide Destitute Asylum. So back in the day when you were unemployed or you were aged or infirm, anything like that, you'd be basically forced into these asylums or admitted into the asylums on certain conditions to receive employment, housing and relief. And there's a kind of a myth in Australian history that there weren't any workhouses from the English Poor Laws, but that's not true. Australia did actually have their own versions of Oliver Twist, and buildings like the Adelaide Destitute Asylum, like the Mount Eliza Asylum in Perth, and throughout all Australia, all these different forms of the workhouse, they were integral into basically disciplining and punishing a section of the working class who, for no fault of their own, couldn't find gainful employment. So I'm going to just walk you guys through very briefly. I know that's pretty scary, but I'm just going to imagine that... I know you should be scared, because you've all just become unemployed. I'm sorry. So we're all unemployed. We're all going to have to go ahead and apply for New Start. So if you were to go and apply for New Start, you probably think it's like the old Commonwealth Employment Service. You walk into a Centrelink office, you stroll in, "G'day Mark, how you going?" You sit down and you have a chat and you say, "Look, I'm going to have to apply for New Start. What do I need to do?" So if you think that's what you would do. You go on, you talk to a human being, you make your application, in a couple of weeks you're on the dole. That's not the case at all. In fact, if you actually go into an employment into a Centrelink office, you're going to be referred just to computers, because the way all of our social security payments are handled today are through these e-government services and e-government websites like MyGov Online and Centrelink. And what you'll need to do to basically make your application for a payment is provide a gross amount of personal information, employment data, banking data, all this different information to evaluate whether or not you are truly deserving of being on the unemployment benefit. So you'll gather all these documents and you'll declare agreement to something that's really important, which is called mutual obligations. So back then in the Adelaide Destitute Asylum, to enter you had to pass two things. The first one was a principle called lesser eligibility, and essentially the principle of lesser eligibility was that the conditions of being inside the workhouse had to be so punitive and so poor and worse than the lowest going wage in the market that only the most deserving would bother to enter, because it'd be so difficult and so hard to live inside. And the second part was called the work test, and this is where the mutual obligations comes in, because to get onto public relief, you had to demonstrate your willingness to work, and you had to regularly demonstrate that. So in the old Adelaide Destitute Asylum, if there was no work to do, and keep in mind this building was modelled on a factory, so they had divisions of labour in each different room, and depending on your previous work history, you come in and do labour from 9 to 5, sunrise to sundown, to earn your payment, or to earn your relief. So that hasn't disappeared, it's just been transformed to this 21st century system, and that goes into the employment service system, which I'll be talking about shortly. So you'll declare your agreement to do these mutual obligation requirements, and then you'll submit your claim through the Express plus Centrelink application, and then you'll get referred into the system, and when you're in the system, it will take about 8 weeks, so hopefully you can survive for 8 weeks without any form of payment. But once you're thrown into the system, you're going to experience something quite strange. You're going to see all this administrative burden that used to be on the public sector side, which has been basically defunded and cut. It's all going to be put onto the individual unemployed worker, and you're going to be put through all these strange work tests and make work activities to demonstrate that you were truly deserving of being unemployed, and to demonstrate that basically you are deserving. So how many of you guys recognise these symbols? Honestly, put your hand up if you have, because this is really interesting. So these symbols here, they're all different companies that work in the privatised employment services industry that was privatised first by Paul Keating in 1996, because the private sector, he thought that introducing private sector competition would basically encourage these private employment service providers to provide better employment services to get more people into jobs, when the issue was, as it is then, that there just weren't enough jobs for people to go into. So you might be surprised to know that this is just some of these employment service providers within 5 k's of this venue, but there are actually 1,635 providers operating in Australia today. And to give you an idea, that's actually more than the McDonald's in Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea combined. So we've got all these employment service providers trying to find people work, and we've got more of them than McDonald's stores in Australia. So I don't know about you guys, but I think that's pretty Mick not cool, you know. So I want to just emphasise how actually big this industry is and how much money we're talking about here. We're talking about multi-billions of dollars a year. So, sorry? I know. But looking at, I'm a Port Adelaide fan, and that's why I'm not looking at the screen, because it pains me to see that other fake corporate team. I'm just joking. Anyway, but I'm just trying to emphasise there's a lot of money here, and actually previously APM used to sponsor the Australian cricket team, and you can imagine how much that sponsorship deal would have cost. So we're talking about a big coffers in this industry. So let's walk you inside the industry. There's a lot of text, so I'm going to walk you through it, don't worry. Okay. So in order to receive your New Start payment, you're going to have to go ahead and declare your agreement to these mutual obligation requirements, these work test requirements, and these principles of lesser eligibility that were echoed in the old Adelaide Destitute Asylum. And as I said before, all these services are delivered by a privatised network of employment service providers. And essentially what these providers do is, on the face of it, they exist to try to get people into employment, and they exist to basically discipline and make sure that unemployed workers continually demonstrate that they are willing to do work. And they're approximately worth about $10 billion, and that was estimated over a 5-year period. So that's an enormous amount of money, and that doesn't even factor in the Parents Next providers, which are for single people on the single parenting payment, and then there is all the disability support provider employment services. So there's a whole host of other employment service providers, and I'm not going to be discussing today. So what do you do in these places? So you might walk in and you'll see that they kind of parody a workplace. In fact, when you walk in, you have to actually dress as if you're going to work. So you'll sit down in this sort of white-collar environment that has the atmosphere of a factory and a school combined, and you'll be told to be a good boy for coming in, and you have to demonstrate all these work-like activities. So you have to do your 20 job searches per month, which is pretty straightforward affair. Well, at least it seems straightforward until you have to do all these different cover letters and different CVs and make sure that you actually can qualify for that job. Otherwise, that application can be rejected because you're not actually applying for a job that you're qualified for. So if you live somewhere in a remote or rural community, there sometimes just isn't 20 jobs that you're qualified for going around. So you're screwed, and you can have your payments suspended for not applying for enough jobs, even though you know you're not qualified to be the CEO of something in your local area, if there are CEOs in local areas. But anyway, the point is, the interesting thing is once you've been in the system for 6 months, and here's the make work side of it, which I really want to talk about, because remember in Bill's talk he talked about how the government kind of chooses the unemployment level. They choose to have unemployment if they can, because they can always buy up all the idle labour if they wish. So in the employment service system, if you've been unemployed for 6 months, you have to do compulsory labour. So you have to do 50 hours a fortnight of free work. And where you do these free work sites differ depending on the local place. So at Adelaide Zoo, for example, they were employing work for the dole workers to do free paving, painting, light infrastructure work, alongside normal workers at the zoo. So they had to rock up every week, do their labour alongside people who were doing the work and getting paid. And they weren't treated like workers because they were unemployed. And this is just some make work activity they had to do, but this one actually did have value because they were doing paving and useful things, but they weren't actually getting paid for it. And what was really interesting about the Adelaide Zoo example is that one of the people there actually got injured. So when you get injured on one of these work for the dole sites, you don't qualify for any work entitlement. So you're not a worker. So say, for example, you got a really severe injury, you don't really get work leave, you don't have any benefits. In fact, you will get punished probably by your private employment service provider for not rocking up at your appointment, which is incredible because there's actually a perverse incentive for these providers to try to funnel you through as many activities as possible, because that's how they make their profit. They get paid by the government for every time you reach something called an employability outcome. So that can be whether or not, it can be as simple as attending a training through one of their own dodgy training arms. So they funnel you to go to one of their own training things, which I've actually been through, and they're just comically bad, and they're comically useful. I was at one where we had 5 people in the room, everybody had a master's degree or higher, and we were all sitting there trying to figure out how to basically go through rudimentary spelling and rudimentary, we actually did some colouring in sheets as well. And that was, I did something pretty good. I coloured in a beautiful Namatjira, reprint. But the point is, this is all just make work stuff to discipline people for daring to access the unemployment benefit. That's what it's about. It's about disciplining the workforce to make sure that the system is so punitive and so cruel that you won't dare to access social security benefits. You'll take the lowest going rate on the market, the shittiest job, rather than spend a day doing bullshit make work in the system. And it's actually a bad system for the caseworkers themselves. When the University of New South Wales did some surveying of the frontline staff, and they asked them basically, what do you do with your time here? What do you do at the employment service provider place? And they said, well, we spend most of our time on compliance and making sure that unemployed workers are acting properly, dressing properly, making sure that they're meeting their mutual obligations. And we're like, well, you're getting paid by the government to find people work. So when do you do the canvassing of the local labour market? And it turns out they spend about less than about 15% of their time to 10% of their time actually bothering to look for people to get jobs. So they're mainly just engaged in punishing unemployed workers for the crime of being unemployed. And they make a lot of errors too, a lot of errors. I mean, as you can see up there, unemployed workers suffered 2.35 million payment suspensions by job act providers over that time period, and the Department of Human Services found those payment suspensions to be wrongfully made. And you don't get, you can reclaim your payment if you want, but if you're a single mother and you have 2 children, that going for several weeks without your benefits and having to go through all these bureaucratic loops to try to get your measly payment back, that's disastrous. You know, that's food not going on the table for your children. That's your social life crippling and disappearing because you can't actually go out because you're that bloody poor. And what's interesting is actually Ernst & Young was commissioned by the Australian government to do an independent review of the work for the dole sites, and they found that 64% of them didn't even make the basic health and safety requirements. And keep in mind, because you're an unemployed worker, you do not get work cover and all this sort of stuff, so you're not treated like a real worker. So you're being forced, on threat of having your payments being cut, to go into these dangerous work sites to do labour a lot of the time alongside paid workers for 6 months of the year, 50 hours a fortnight for free, and if you get injured, you're screwed, more or less. We actually did some surveying of our own members. It was only about 1,000, so we did about 1,000 of our own members. We asked them, 15 questions about what was their life like on Newstart, and this one here is a bit disturbing. So we asked them, what happened when your payments got suspended on Newstart? What did you do? How did you survive? And you can see here that some of them, got support from friends and family. Some of them had to skip meals, so go hungry. Some of them had to take out a payday loan, which is really troubling because I see all these B-pay stuff everywhere. Had to rely on charity. And the saddest of all, 84 of our members became homeless over a 2-month period. And that's only 1,000 of our 15,000 members we surveyed. So I'm scared to think how many of our members are being pushed into homelessness every day in this system. And I'm going to briefly just talk about Josh's story, because I think it's really important. And I don't think that many people here would have heard of Josh's story. Does anybody here know the name of Josh Park-Fing? That's encouraging, actually. I'm really happy to see there are a few hands. That's really good. So Josh Park-Fing, he was an 18-year-old boy from Toowoomba. He was unemployed. He's been unemployed for 6 months, so he was forced into work for the dole. He was forced into doing work for the dole at the Toowoomba Showgrounds, and he thought that the site was dangerous. He looked around, what he was being asked to do seemed dangerous to him, so he filed a report to his privatised employment service provider saying, I don't feel safe at the site, please come inspect it, I actually fear for my life. And Josh was told that if he does not go to his work for the dole site and do his labour for 50 hours a fortnight, he will have his payments suspended, which will result in, well, you know what it results in. So Josh, one fateful day, went to his work for the dole site. He told his dad on that day, work for the dole shit, I really don't want to go to it. This site feels dangerous, but what do you do? And what's really interesting is he basically says, even if you go ahead and have a work injury, they won't fill out paperwork because the employment service provider needs you to stay at that site, otherwise they don't get their money. That's their cash cow. Not employing labour, they profit off not employing labour. So 4 hours after sending that message to his father, Josh Park-Fing fell off a moving vehicle, suffered a brain hemorrhage, and he died shortly afterwards. And to this day, the company that killed Josh Park-Fing has not been investigated. They have not been heavily fined. They've just been able to get away with industrial manslaughter. And that's because he's unemployed. So we have not only a disciplinary and awful sort of system, we have a system that's actually hurting and killing unemployed workers. So what do we need to do? We're in this paradoxical situation. We have sort of this, this great example of late capitalism where we have a whole industry that profits off not employing labour and in a way creates no value if you take, just depending on what labour theory of value or what theory of value you subscribe to it. But it's clearly broken, clearly not working, and we need solutions. So what solutions do we need? Well, I think today we've been discussing some big ideas and big solutions like public sector investment, vastly employing all the idle labour in the economy, and having a job guarantee for those people who have been long-term unemployed and need to have a low-skill entry-level job to basically develop their human capital. So that's where we need to go, and we need to go there urgently, because if we don't, more unemployed workers will get injured and they'll die, and the trade union movement will be crippled at the bottom end. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. Now you can see why we want to scrap the Job Active Network, or I know I do, and move back to the Commonwealth Employment Service and move away from the punitive approach to dealing with the unemployed. Our final speaker in this session is Alice Clark. She's the Executive Director of Shelter SA, Chairperson of National Shelter. She's an Adjunct Research Fellow at the University of South Australia, and she's many other things as well. And one of the things that Alex was talking about was the issue of housing. If you are reliant on New Start, or if you have a low income. And Alice is going to talk to us about housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much for inviting me here today, and hi everybody. I'm Alice. As Stephen said, I'm from Shelter SA, which is the peak body for housing in South Australia. So in thinking about ending poverty, I'm going to be talking about housing poverty and the experience of homelessness. Before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that we're standing on Kaurna land. The Kaurna people are the traditional people of Adelaide. If you're not from these parts, it's spelt with a K, not a G. And I'd like to pay my respects to Kaurna elders past and present. The irony of that acknowledgement is never lost on me, because our Aboriginal brothers and sisters are the most disadvantaged group when it comes to housing, when it comes to the way that we've commodified land in this country, and my thoughts are often with them when I'm giving these sorts of talks. So, as a peak body for housing, what does Shelter do? We develop evidence-based policy positions. So when I think of, what does that mean? What does evidence-based mean? To us, it means that we look at high-quality data, academic publications, government reports to formulate policy positions, but importantly, we take them out into the community to test them and hear what people think of them before we take them up to do our advocacy around those public policies. So we spend a lot of time with politicians in doing that advocacy and pushing for change. We spend a lot of time using media and social media, and we're on every platform known to man, so please do follow us if you are that way inclined. So being the fourth speaker after so many great talks, after lunch we need a strategy to keep you all awake. So I want you to bear with me and help me do a very quick survey, if you would. So if you're able to, could you please stand up and help me with my survey? It will be painless, I assure you. If you're not able to stand up, that's okay. Have a little wriggle, have a stretch, because you are going to stay awake until I finish. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about trends in housing in a minute. So I wanted to just test with you what's going on for you guys in your housing. So if thinking of your usual place of abode, maybe not last night or tonight if you've travelled here, but your usual residence, if you consider yourself a renter, would you please take your seats back? We don't have to be too precise. So, as I suspected when I first got here, you're perhaps not a good match with the general population in Australia, in a polite way. So now, the second group of people I'd like to sit down is if you are currently paying off a mortgage. Could you please take your seats? Right, so we're not going to now embarrass all those people left standing by asking what your actual, giving you one more category to fit into, but we assume that many of you will have finished paying for your homes or are in a small minority of other categories. But so could the rest of you please be seated, and thank you very much. So the point of doing that is to talk about housing trends. So what's happening in Australia at the moment, and what's happening to the Great Australian Dream is it's on the decline. Believe it or not, the number of people who do own their own homes outright is declining. The number of people who are entering into or are in the home buying market and paying off a mortgage is also declining, and therefore the number of renters is going up. So it's slowly happening over time. And we know that there are more and more people who reach retirement age, for example, who have not been able to achieve paying their mortgage off. So that's the big picture landscape. The general population of Australia, we can probably roughly divide those categories up into thirds. So if you're either a renter, you're purchasing your own home, or you own your home outright, and there's a small percentage of the other category, as I mentioned. So in many respects, we're creating a society of haves and have-nots, and the have-nots, unfortunately, are starting to increase in number as well. And we've heard a lot about that. Much of it is about unemployment. So one of the reasons that we know that people are becoming worse off is when we look at homelessness and people experiencing homelessness. So in Australia, in a 12-month period, there are more than 280,000 people who experience homelessness. So we know that that number's probably an undercount, because they're only the people that receive a service that get counted. We know there are many others who don't access the services, don't know about the services, or are turned away from the services. Many of those hundreds of thousands of people can't get what they want and need, because what they want and need is a place to live. And we just don't have enough to go around. So as well as people experiencing homelessness, we know that there are hundreds of thousands of renters who are paying so much rent every week that they can't afford to feed their families, that they are at dire risk of becoming homeless, as Alex told us in his talk. So the homelessness system costs us millions of dollars every year. The human services system costs us trillions of dollars every year across the country. But unfortunately, what we've set up is a system that works at the crisis end of people's situations and their lives. And we're actually having a self-sustaining system that keeps people living in poverty and living with the various types of disadvantage that are out there. So it's not just in housing and homelessness. Wherever you look, you'll find this in the child protection system, which is an absolute shambles at the moment. If we think about domestic violence, we only start helping people after there's a physical violence incident. We put women in shelters. They leave those shelters and go back to violence because there's no housing for them. So we need to think about tipping a system on its head to move away from crisis and go to early intervention and prevention if we want to see any real change and improvement in people's circumstances. So for those reasons, we think at Shelter SA, a job guarantee is a fantastic idea. We could immediately lift those hundreds of thousands of people who can't afford their rent, the hundreds of thousands of people who are experiencing homelessness out of those situations, and we would very quickly save millions of dollars on services that are sent to be a band-aid, essentially. We have lost so much public housing in this country. This is one of the other issues that I haven't mentioned yet, that for those people living on low incomes in the bottom two household income quintiles, they desperately need public housing. So we've seen that system be decimated over the last 10 to 20 years. And as a little case study for South Australia, over the last 20 years, we've lost 20,000 public housing properties. And it's no surprise that there's more than 20,000 South Australians experiencing homelessness every year, or that there are about 20,000 people on the public housing waiting list. So it's not a coincidence that those numbers are the same. And it does measure the problem, And it means that we could, if we chose, do something about it. While we do our policy work at Shelter SA and lobby governments and try to persuade governments that they need to do better in this space, we do have a couple of exciting initiatives that are working within the system that we have now to create new ways of housing people, and I'd like to just briefly tell you about them so that you don't leave feeling all depressed. So firstly, the first one is an initiative of a private developer who came to us about 2 years ago and said, I want to build housing for poor people. And I thought, well, this is very curious. Do come in and do tell us about your plans. So he had this vision that he would be able to create home ownership product that's currently not available in the market for people living on low incomes. So we worked with him to say, well, what would that look like? Who are the demographic that you're trying to target? And we explained to him about household income quintiles and looked at Home Start, which is our state financial lender, and said, you know, what is it possible for someone on $30,000 a year, a household, to achieve when it comes to home ownership? And we were really delighted that he has achieved a house and land package that's going to be available for $200,000. So with a first homeowners grant for people who haven't owned a home before, we've got a current state government initiative of a $10,000 interest-free deposit loan and a $3,000 deposit. People living on low incomes can achieve borrowings to purchase these homes. And the developer's vision is that we take tens of thousands of people living on low incomes out of homelessness, out of expensive private rental markets, and create home ownership opportunities for them. And I think that's one of the ways forward for Australia, to stop building homes that no one can afford. We've got all these builders going bankrupt. Let's build products that people can afford. And the other fantastic thing about these homes is that they are highly energy efficient, which is something we also asked for. So it's going to cost less than $1 a day for your utilities in these dwellings. So I don't know about you, but the thought of getting a utilities bill for under $400 a year is pretty way off what we've got here in South Australia, which we call, you know, the triple whammy of high unemployment, high utilities and unaffordable housing market. So if you want to know more about those dwellings, please come and talk to us. And just very quickly, the other two projects we work on, one is called Capital Asset. So that's where we educate not-for-profit landowners about how they can grow their land assets and use them to take the price of land out of housing to create products for people living on low incomes. And the other one is called Homes for Good, which is a new initiative of ours. It's going to be launched in a few short weeks, and that's a scheme for private residential property owners to put their properties into our scheme and be happy to accept a sub-market rent. So that way we can at least try and increase the pool of properties that we've got for people living on low incomes. But the number one thing we always ask for is an investment in the supply of public housing by governments. They have many millions of dollars worth of public assets that belong to us, the taxpayers, and we would like to see them urgently make that sort of investment to grow the supply of public housing and think about it as essential infrastructure, not just the nice to have. So that's me. So thank you very much for listening. And as I said, you can sign up for our e-news on our website. It's quick and easy. And please follow us on social media. Thank you for having me.
Weren't those four great talks? Please thank all the four speakers for me. I'm going to make myself very unpopular now. I know that Alice can't stay with us for very long, so if you have questions for Alice, send them to me at stephen.hale@adelaide.edu.au, and I promise they will get to Shelter SA. You can, of course, contact Shelter SA yourself. The other speakers are going to be around, so I hope you'll come and ask them questions later on. We will have an app. We already have an app.